How to become the best version of yourself at any age. So today we're going to talk about becoming the best version of yourself. And it's a big subject. I mean, this is just the first in a series. I'd like to dig in deeper as we go along, but in the spirit of starting somewhere, let's get the concept out there and get the conversation going. And remember, the choice is yours. You decide what to do with the information and keep what you like. Experiment with it as you like, and let me know what you think, if you like. Before we get started, I want to thank you for stopping by the Internal Executive. This is where we explore the many choices that we're faced with every day, using the wisdom of those who have gone before us as a guide. And of course, there is no client-provider relationship here. All information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. I do have a previous audio or podcast where I introduce Byrne's work. Look below for the link. But briefly, he describes 5 components or ego states, I like to call them avatars, that exist in our psyches. So with that, let's get to it. Now, like I said, it's a big subject. And so how do we even figure out what the best version of ourselves is? Certainly, that's not something that is going to be figured out in a moment or a few moments. It's going to take some work. And of course, like most things, the more you put into something, the more you get out of it. But before we try to figure out what that might look like, I want to introduce you to the different resources you have available within you if you haven't yet met them. This is not about dissociative identity disorder, just for the record. But I am a huge fan of Eric Byrne's model. He was a pioneer in his day, a bit of a rebel actually, did a really great job of explaining both how the human psyche operates when interacting with others, but provided a way to better understand our own self-talk and how we work as individuals. So I'll explain it the way I understand it. I've made some alterations. It doesn't sound so academic, 1960s style, which was before my time. And I recognize that kind of language, we just don't talk that way. So think of it this way. You have a committee of 5, and as I mentioned, there's a link below if you want to go a little more in depth. But basically, according to Byrne, we all have a child self, and there's 2 types. So 2 avatars. We have a happy child or a hurt child. Perhaps an adapted child is another way I think I've heard it said. We have the adult. I don't particularly care for that word. I think it's a little confusing, so I say adult scientist. And then we have a parent self, which also has 2 parts, a nurturing parent and a critical parent. Each serve a purpose, and when they're in balance and healthy, we have a high-functioning, well-adjusted person. And when people are facing challenges emotionally, relationally, professionally, or with their health, or maybe something else, but they're really challenges that are holding them back from being the best version of themselves, they're often faced with many decisions. And those decisions can move the needle, to better or worse, depending on the scenario, right? So don't get me wrong. The original problem may have nothing to do with any of the choices that person made. But moving forward, when there is a choice to be made, ideally, the person is utilizing as many of their internal resources as well as external resources as they can to make the best decisions to get the outcome they seek. So this podcast is not about solving a single problem, but rather exploring a skill set that can be applied to many problems. In other videos, I'll take a more specific approach, but I want to introduce the underpinnings first. So, balance among the avatars or ego states typically starts with the scientist. It's the last to begin development from a childhood perspective. And so I think it is one that can be hijacked right out of the gate. If you think about it, the child self is our emotional self, right? That's the baby, and the baby learns to speak and starts developing other skills, right? And maybe the seeds of being a scientist are emerging as the child tests reality and object constancy, things like that. But the moral self and the nurturing self initially are based on what we observe in our caregivers. So that process can result in exact replica of our parents or an amalgamation of our parents, but it can also be, or not just our parents, whoever our caregivers were, or it can be altered as we become more self-aware, keep what we like, what we think works, or what aligns with our values as we grow. And that's normal. So when a person individuates in their early teens, sometimes it doesn't happen until later, but that's used to be the ideal, is that would, start happening in your early teens. You question whether your parents understand the world, blah, 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 and then you rebel, and then you settle down and you keep what you agree with, and you reject that which you either don't like, which is really the child self driving, or that which you've determined through self-exploration doesn't align with your morals as you see the world. So that quick little explanation, I hope that made sense. I was kind of off the cuff. But the scientist is responsible for observation, data collection, analysis, and synthesis. So if we're not self-aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it, we don't really have that resource available to us to determine if we're making good decisions or why we're making the decisions we're making. And of course, everybody varies in their level of self-awareness, and there are blind spots. Incredibly self-aware people can have a blind spot where they're oblivious to the mistakes they're making. So hence, to be the best version of yourself at any age, we're always growing. We're always exploring what we can do to make our situation better, or the version of us that we want to show up for ourselves and the people we care about, the best version of us, right? So the scientist also mediates between the moral self and the child self. If the child self has too loud a voice, the scientist's job is to notice and engage his or her inner parent. The critical parent says no and inhibits damaging behavior. That's a healthy critical parent. The nurturing parent that's healthy comes up with a way to meet the unmet needs of the child, so it reduces acting on impulses. The scientist reminds the child self, without passion, that failure to change will result in more pain. Now, this exercise of learning to identify the inner voices or avatars results in better decision-making, because now you're aware of the tasks associated with bad decision-making. I put that in quotes. Bad decision-making. Of course, learning how to make better decisions so you can become the best version of yourself involves learning. Learning processes that make you a better analyzer and learning about yourself. So, number 1, learning about how to determine what's true. This is so key. And back in the day, logic was fashionable. There's still people who embrace logic. And I have to admit that even back in my day, which I won't name the exact decade, suffice it, but even then logic was not as, it was kind of cultural. If you were living in a very tolerant, artsy, permissive community, logic was not at the forefront of that culture. And honestly, that is a culture I grew up in. So I learned more about formal logic as an adult. I was fortunate that some of the adults around me were logical thinkers. So that's my little take on it. Find out what is logical. I'll do a separate podcast on the types of logical arguments that there are and logical fallacies and things like that. But I'll just give a simple example, kind of a congruency exercise, something that's observable but incongruent. An example of a star. Okay, we'll do that. Well, a movie star who owns a yacht and an airplane and does commercials about saving the environment. There's something incredibly incongruent with that messaging. So you can see that kind of presentation as being perhaps disingenuous or dishonest. The trick here is to make sure you're not doing that to yourself. That's human behavior and it's normal, When we're self-aware, we can examine the quality of our arguments we're making and make sure that we're not pretending something's true because we want to satisfy our child or our sense of moral superiority or something like that, which I would say is still in the child place. Again, let's just stay on topic. So to create the best version of yourself, you want to stop reacting and use a plan or a strategy for what you want changed, which again engages the scientists. So for the aspects of your psyche or the avatars to be balanced, you need to get to know them, know what they value, and know what has caused some of them to be stunted, if that is the case. And, I think a case can be made that we all have aspects of ourselves that maybe not stunted, but that if we explore it and examine it, perhaps it's time to give that more play. I mean, you see that a lot with grandparents, right? This is an example. Sorry, I go too fast. But think about how in a lot of families, the parents are so strict, then their kids have kids, and then they're so nice and easygoing. Well, how did that happen? Well, it may be that the parent changed, consciously or not, to embrace their own inner child and let their own grown children carry the burden of being the moral self to the moral instructor to the children, because it's someone else's turn, right? So they get to be more, and that's just in some families. But as people change over time, sometimes it is a conscious choice to bring out a different side of themselves, and sometimes it's unconscious. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is the general topic. I'd love to hear what specifics you'd like to apply this to. Let me know in the comments below. If you like what you hear, of course, subscribe and hit the like button. It helps the algorithm. Truly, I'm very interested in where to go. I have some ideas, and keep an eye out for podcasts on how to improve things like health, relationships, emotional regulation, and motivation, and more. I really appreciate you stopping by, and till next time.